In the age of the internet, receiving news can be as simple as looking on your wrist. We have never been better connected, and news stories can be communicated worldwide within a matter of hours. In fact, with the rise of social media, it's been proven harder to contain and factualize stories rather than share it. But what about 200 years ago? Of course, the mediocre scandals of celebrities were irrelevant, but news on a major scale, such as taxes and matters of the law and court, had to be communicated to all four corners of the country and wider beyond. The majority of towns had a town crier to help relay the news of the day. The news was usually travelled by messenger and stagecoach to the various towns, and the crier, who was usually a man of means with the ability to read and write, would then write in a roll of parchment the topics from the day before relaying them to the locals from a focal point in the town, usually a square. For a population that was mostly illiterate, it was an easy way to get the news. However, it was not the most reliable, and most news was subject to gossip and miscommunication. It also didn't help that the crier was a man of influence, and the small minority manipulated the news for their own gain. The idea of distributing the news in a paper format went as far back as the Romans, but it was the invention of the printing press that was a real game changer. Rather than writing the news by hand, the news could be printed en masse. As more and more people became literate, it became necessary to produce a more reliable service. In the early 1700s, the first newspapers began to emerge. These were usually distributed locally and by hand, but the stagecoach company saw an opportunity and they ran with it. They offered to take bundles of newspapers to surrounding towns and cities. On one side, it was much more lucrative for the new newspaper companies than the town criers, and it would ensure that the news would be as factual as possible. But on the other, it was painfully slow. It would take several days, if not a week, for the news to be distributed nationally. From the moment the modern railway had become a thing, one of its first orders was to take the newspapers. The Times, the Observer and the Telegraph were well established at this point, but like all papers, they were struggling to reach other towns and cities. In 1831, the first order of conveyance were brought forward to the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. It was a fantastic success, and soon other companies were competing for their own orders, taking more and more traffic from the tired stagecoaches. In 1847, London's Fleet Street had become a big publishing centre, and the newspapers needed dedicated trains to take the papers to the cities on time. The train would leave early morning and were considered perishable goods. As such, the trains were marked as express goods and were considered the utmost importance. Travelling back in time a bit, in 1792, a kiosk opened that would prove to be one of the most influential driving forces of the newspaper movement. It was a simple kiosk in London, run by Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Henry William Smith sadly passed away shortly after opening, but his wife Sarah and her children took on the venture and made a decent business. When William Henry Smith took over, he renamed it to W.H. Smith and Sons. He was perfectly poised to expand his business, and in the midst of the railway boom, he wanted his next kiosk to be in a place where foot traffic was plentiful, the connections were great, and give people full advantage of train journeys and give the people something to do. There was only one place that all three could be achieved, and that was the stations. The first ever railway kiosk was put in place at Euston Station in 1848, and it was a roaring success. It worked exactly as William had hoped. People with means to travel would call at the kiosk to grab a paper to read on the journey, and it was the first to utilise the railway for paper deliveries straight from the presses. The first train ran from February 1848 and went from Euston to Edinburgh. The run was astonishingly quick, taking about 10.5 hours, but when you consider stops and that whole cargo had to be transferred not once, but twice between trains due to lack of bridges, it definitely turned heads as to what the railways could bring to the industry. In light of this success, other contracts followed in Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham. In time, the kiosk sold more than just papers. They started to sell cheap publications nicknamed the Yellowbacks, and they also started a mini library service. For a nominal fee, patrons could borrow books for their long journey and return the books at their destination. It just took only 6 years for the company to grow enough to be recognised as one of the main newspaper distributors in the country. In 1855, newspaper stamp duty was abolished, which saw a boom in newspapers being produced outside London city walls. Local dailies were being produced and were on kiosk shelves before the London trains arrived. Like with the travelling post office, staff were employed to work on the trains to help bundle and sort the papers for each station. It was much quicker than bundling them before they were loaded onto or having station staff trying to sort them after the train had arrived. But in case of smaller stations, if there was just 1 or 2 bundles, the bundled papers were simply thrown from the train without even attempting to slow down. Not exactly the safest method for the post station staff and the waiting passengers. 1 newspaper's hitting you doesn't hurt, 30 or more hurtling towards you, and relative speed could put you out. Up in Scotland, the Edinburgh-based newspaper The Scotsman decided it would charter its own train exclusively for its own paper. It was the first newspaper to do this and turned heads of the publishers. The Times followed suit in 1875 and chartered its own train. It got a path to Liverpool via Birmingham an hour earlier than the standard newspaper train and was able to get its own publication on the store shelves before anyone else. In light of this, the railways moved the standard newspaper trains earlier and earlier, some even setting off at 4 a.m. The Scotsman took the movement of the train seriously. So seriously, in fact, that in 1904 they moved headquarters and put its own sidings right below the masses of printing presses. With the train so close, not only was it in prime position to move the papers, but it was also able to be used to bring in raw materials for the presses to use. Another technique for getting the paper to the waiting trains quicker was the use of partial printing. News articles that were more editorial, jokes and non-news could be printed days in advance. This meant that the only real rush was the first few pages with the current news. The national distributors would concentrate on getting those first pages done and get those pages on the way. Once delivered with the ready-made middle sections, it was up to the staff to put the papers together. Special fans were added to the train, especially for packing and filling. Once the papers were completed, they were then moved to the waiting staff, ready to bundle them up. But what was working on a newspaper train really like? It doesn't sound much putting papers together and bundling them, but one of my earliest jobs involved working with newspapers. The work starts early. For the delivery to the waiting train, many had to be about the station around 3:30 a.m. to help load the papers onto the carriages as they arrived from the publishers. The larger publishers would have their own carriages and people ready to sort out the papers. If the papers were already completed with no partial prints, then the staff would unbundle the papers from each publisher and regather the papers from different publishers together depending on the order and bundle them together using twine. The bundles were then numbered and addressed to the individual vendors, so each paper knew how many had been delivered to each vendor. If it was a small order, then the bundles would be thrown on the move. If it was large, then the train would have to stop and the papers would be unloaded. The work wasn't easy. The papers and the bundles were extremely heavy, especially with the addition of inserts that had to be added as they were sorted. And coming from experience, on a Sunday, it was very common to have 5 or 6 inserts per paper. I used to sort each insert into separate piles and then take one from each to put into the paper. For me to get even remotely done for 10 o'clock opening, I used to have to work at least 5 hours beforehand. It was tough work and disheartening to see by 10:30 most of the inserts ended up on the floor and the ink used on the papers would stain everything. I had to wear a uniform as part of my job and with it white shirts. It would only take a week for my shirts to be stained grey and the black logo on the shirt sleeves, which was sewn cotton, would be stained orange due to the many times I had to bleach the shirts white, as the bleach was the only thing that brought the stain out. My hands were also stained black and no amount of scrubbing would remove the ink. After I left that job, it took a good month for the ink stains on my hands to disappear. I'd only been doing the job, though, a few years. Imagine what state you'd be in doing it for decades. Once the train had arrived, then it was all hands on deck. If the delivery person wasn't there to collect his papers, then there'd be no waiting, and it would have been a frantic dash to the station to collect what they could. On average, the crew would handle around 130,000 papers per night. Thanks to other well-known titles such as the Express, the Mirror and the Daily Mail, the railways held a great monopoly on the news movement. It was the fastest way to move hundreds of tons daily, something that few could ever dream to compete with. When the Big Four took over in 1923, the newspaper boom exploded. The vast majority of people were now literate. Radios in the home were newfangled things, and most people relied on the newspapers for important and daily announcements. This included stocks and shares and any tax news, advertisements, editorials, and of course the latest news from now around the world, thanks to the invention of the telephone and the telegraph. The speed in which the men and women worked was staggering, and the Great Western proclaimed that they had the fastest services in the world. With a King-class locomotive and a full train, they managed just over a mile a minute and had delivered papers from London to Plymouth in less than 2 hours, and that's including stops. There were also times that the papers weighed the engine down so much that a banker had to be required to get the train up the hills. The work on the newspapers remained relatively unchanged, even as steam made way for diesel. Thanks to the sheer number of papers and their weight, it even managed to survive the coming of the roads and the lorries. By the 1960s, British Rail was moving 50 to 75 newspaper trains every night, and at various times, depending on when the paper had finished printing. W.H. Smiths helped keep the trains moving by building wholesale houses. This meant the train could drop off the bundles there and the lorries could collect them without clogging up the station. And it was averaged out that the papers would be delivered within 15 minutes of the train departing. These wholesale houses would serve hundreds of retail outlets and shops and made the movements a lot more organised. Newspaper trains carried on right through to the 80s. But to the shock of all, The Guardian announced it would not be renewing its contract with British Rail and moved its distribution to the roads. But its biggest blow came from News International. News International was a merger of papers owned by Rupert Murdoch. This included The Sun, The Times and The News of the World. Murdoch wanted to move his papers out of Fleet Street, but it was proven difficult. The papers had been produced there for around 200 years, and the men were very skillful workers. They were also part of a closed shop union, meaning that all workers applying for jobs had to be part of a printing union. The workers also had a lot of power. Thanks to the closed shop union, if the union wanted to strike, then the companies were scuppered. Murdoch had at his disposal new technology for the presses. However, the presses implementation would have meant a lot of redundancies. It was cheaper to run and it was more productive than the older presses in Fleet Street, but the unions were not standing for it. The technology was going to put many of their men out of work. Murdoch knew he had to weaken the union. He started by spreading false rumours that Newspaper International was going to produce a new paper called the London Post in a new factory in Wapping. At the same time, Margaret Thatcher's anti-trade union law came into being. This meant that any current employee that went on strike while negotiations were being held would be sacked on the spot and lose any redundancy. Murdoch started to move any non-union employees to Wapping and hired new employees under strict instructions that they were not allowed to join any press unions. The false rumour was starting to spread, and the printing unions were not too happy with Murdoch's ideas, so they started negotiations with Murdoch's legal team. But no mutual ground could be sought. So on the 26th of January 1986, nearly 6,000 workers went on strike. Murdoch seized the opportunity, fired almost every one of the staff on the spot. Murdoch had achieved the necessary losses in the manpower he needed, reduced the union's hold on the papers completely, and in one swift move, moved all of his new papers to Rappin. Unfortunately, the law was against the men. As Murdoch and the unions were still negotiating, they got nothing. The printing unions, incensed at being conned and in support of the men, organised large demonstrations outside the Rappin plant. Although the unions maintained that the demonstrations were peaceful, the statement was far from the truth, and over 400 people were injured in the protests. The strike and the losses reached the ears of the rail unions, and in solidarity they threatened to black any newspaper printed at Rappin. Murdoch had anticipated this and had already signed a contract with road hauliers. British Rail claimed compensation for the contract breach, but the compensation was nothing compared to the £125 million hole that the newspaper's losses had occurred. One by one, like a house of cards, the other papers began to back out. British Rail conceded its newspaper dominance, and an over 150 alliance between the papers and the trains came to an end on the 10th of July 1988. Today, it's the roads that take the swathes of newspapers up and down the country. W.H. Smiths, however, still retain a majority share of the railway kiosk market, and every major station has a W.H. Smiths. It's obviously grown with the times and over the centuries, but its premise is still the same. It still sells items many would find useful for travel: books, snacks, and of course, newspapers. It has dabbled in the technology market too, and you can buy the latest personal tech, from AirPods to power banks. It was amazing how intertwined it was with the railway, and how a little kiosk helped shape a 15-decade industry.